It's a funny thing the way coincidence works with the sea to bring us together. A few years ago, Ros and I were researching a book that we were doing, and we needed to find out about a man called Edward Allcard. Now, Edward Allcard, if you don't know who he was one of those great mariners of the late period of the 30s and in the 50s and 60s, who sailed the seas and who wrote books about it. And he wrote good books, and he was a great mariner, really, was Edward. And he was one of my heroes when I was a boy, because when I was a little lad growing up in an industrial town in the north of England, I devoured books about the sea and about people sailing them, and particularly the books of the single-handers and people who didn't have much money. So Edward was always of interest to me, and when Ros and I were putting this book together, we wanted to use an extract from one of his books, and the extract was well, it was grand, really. He was sailing out of the Azores as a young man, bound for Africa, and he was 2 days out, and he was sitting in his cockpit, and a hand appeared in the companionway. Well, he went cold all over, didn't he? I mean, you would, wouldn't you, when you think you're on your own out there? And it came up, and following the hand up from the companionway was a beautiful young girl from Portugal, from the Azores, who was looking to open her life up and find freedom through the seas and through the person of Edward, really, who was going to be the key to opening the world to her. And, well, he delivered the goods. He dropped her off some while later in Casablanca, and he writes about this in the most gentlemanly, old-fashioned way, so that what went on or didn't go on, we just don't know. He leaves it to our imagination, which in gentler times was how it should have been. Absolutely right. So there's Edward Allcard. We decide we have to research him, and my wife Ros gets in touch with his wife, who we assumed was going to be his widow, Claire, because by now the man must have been of great antiquity. But it turned out that Edward was alive and well and living in Andorra, aged 101. And so then we discovered that he and Claire had bought, later in life, I think in the 60s, no, it would have been later than that, probably in the 70s, they bought a Baltic trader called Johanna. And in this boat, that's a big boat, 90-ton Baltic trader, great big catch. And in this boat, of great antiquity, they sailed the seas and wrote another book. Claire wrote a fantastic book called The Gypsy Life about this period. Now, that boat, Johanna, I served on her in 1969-70, before Edward Allcard had ever heard of her. And it was on that boat that I met my wife Ros. So the boat had been instrumental in moulding my whole existence, really. And well, we had to meet Edward Allcard. He was still there, and so we got my old shipmate John, and off we went to Andorra, and we found Edward Allcard himself in the flesh. And Claire was good to us, and we spent a day with them, and it was a magical thing. And in due course, we went our way. We went to see the boat because Edward had donated the boat to a sort of sail training organisation down in the Mediterranean that was helping out young kids in Catalonia. That was nice. And then we flew home. End of story, we thought. But it wasn't actually, because another chum, Nicholas Gray, went to see Edward because he too was researching a book. He was researching this book, Astronauts of Cape Horn, which is a grand book about the early single-handed circumnavigators of Cape Horn, who at the time manned flight to the moon was packed up. More people had been to the moon than had sailed around Cape Horn single-handed. And one of them, of course, was Edward Allcard. Well, Nicholas was there with Edward shortly before he died. Edward was now 102. And Edward decided that when he went, he was going to leave his corking irons to me. Well, that's a thing, isn't it? Isn't that a wonderful thing? But there was a conversation with Claire and with Nicholas, and they decided that really I'm getting on a bit. It wasn't really right to leave them to me. And anyway, I've got a fiberglass boat. I don't need them now except to help people out. No, they would give them to my daughter, Hannah, who has a 1909 gaff yawl and who is carrying the flag forward for the old wooden boats. And her husband, Dan, is learning the skills, and I bet he can cork with the best of them by now. He's got my irons at the moment, but I'll be getting them back because he will be getting Edward's. And Nicholas was launching his book at the boat show, in Southampton. And here comes the coincidence. It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? He brought the corking irons back for me because Edward had gone. The corking irons were passed to him. He was down there and he was coming up my way. So he brought the corking irons, and here they are. I'm going to open them up for the first time and see what we've got. Well, God, but look at that. That's a seam rake, the real thing. You get that in the seam and you heave it out. That's seen some action, hasn't it? God, look at that. And we've got a nice finishing iron there with a groove in it for driving the oakum into the seam. And oh yeah, beautiful little chinking iron. Very narrow across the face. Mine's wider than that, but they've got this nice knob on the end, and that's what you hit when you're driving it in. And this is the corking hammer. What a wonderful instrument when it's driven home properly like that. This is great because when you whack away with this, it makes a particular sound, and when you're driving oakum into the seam, it rings when you've got it right. And when it's giving resistance and is actually holding the boat together, it rings back at you. And the sound of a corking iron ringing round a yard is the sound of yesterday. And it's the sound of today, and it's the sound of tomorrow. Because so long as there are wooden boats, there'll always be people corking. And when they're corking Hannah's boat now on the Hamble River, I bet Edward will be up there in the sky and he'll be listening to his corking hammer as it rings out as Dan drives the corking into his garments on his old boat. What a great thing. I'm going to finish with a picture of the boat which Edward and I had, both of us, at different periods of our lives. Here she is, Johanna. And I'm going to leave you with a little photograph of me, Edward, Claire, his wife, and my old shipmate John in Andorra when Edward was 101. A grand old man of the sea, a wonderful coincidence, and the wheel turns and the circle is unbroken.